This is a deep speculation video because we know little to nothing about class balance or siege map mechanics in Ashes of Creation. That being said, I'm going to pull from my experience in previous PvP MMOs in large-scale PvP and siege situations for this one. And I think for those of you that like theory crafting and speculation, you might enjoy this one, even if you are not a PvPer. Steven has talked some about siege mechanics, class balance, and the preparatory work for sieges that happens on both sides. But outside of some old quotes on the wiki, we don't know that much about how sieges will function. So I've decided to avoid talking specifically about these mechanics. Yes, there were sieges in Alpha 1, but they were mostly placeholder. I've talked about the mechanics that we know about that are on the wiki in my Everything Known About Ashes of Creation video, and I will link the wiki pages in the description that go in depth on these. I will say I do think some of the objectives they talk about in the siege mechanics might be pretty valuable to hold in theory, but we don't know yet. To make things simple, let's assume both sides have done an equal amount of work to prepare for the siege, and barring the natural defender advantage, what is it that then differentiates the two sides? Well, to me, there are 4 things, and there's probably more, but these are the ones that I would rank as the most important. And in this order. Number 1, tactics. Number 2, numbers. Number 3, gearing. And number 4, individual player skill. Now, I've probably lost some of you because a lot of people think large-scale PvP is just a numbers game. And to a point, it certainly can be, but I have seen plenty of outnumbered fights where the smaller group won in many past MMOs. If the smaller group has superior tactics, gear, more skilled players, or any combination of the 3. But to me, tactics is the most important thing to have in large-scale PvP. Before I get into tactics, I do first want to talk about the numbers game a bit regarding sieges, because so far Intrepid has stated that sieges will be in the open world and only parts of it might be instanced. These instanced part of the siege are said to be short, objective-based battles that affect the main siege. Now, it does sound like they're open to the idea of instancing the entire siege, but as of the most recent quotes, they are still intending for the main siege to be open world, which could drastically affect the numbers game. Here are the most recent quotes from Steven regarding sieges and the open world nature of them.
Will guild castles also be instanced for the initial AI raid to capture the castle, or will it be an open world raid the first time around so that players can sabotage each other's efforts before a capture?
We haven't really actually, just to caveat this question, we haven't determined that that castle sieges will be instanced yet. And as a matter of fact, right now they're in the open world. That might not come to pass. But also because your question is about the original ownership and the NPCs that exist within them. Those are also in the open world unless we come across a test that suggests we should otherwise consider it instanced.
This one was from,
and I see one. Just a reminder, participations for castles does require registration, right, on the guild's behalf. And what that registration allows you to do is to be a victor. It's to have the potential to win. It grants the ability of the guild leader and or potentially officers, if we determine to go down that route, the ability to seal the ownership of the castle. So you could have people who pass by, see there's a castle siege in progress, and just jump in and participate for funsies, but they're not having the ability in that initial assault against the NPCs to actually win the castle. They could just be there and participate. The same could be true also for when a castle's owned by a guild and assaulted by another guild. You could see some players participate in that siege if they're not registered. The problem is for being a registered attacker, you have the ability to respawn on the siege field. If you're not a registered attacker or defender and you die on the siege field, you are ported very, very far away to a very far respawn point. So there's a significant disadvantage in that regard as well.
Whereas, originally we talked about how, zerging is always a problem in a lot of these MMORPGs where you really can't control the number of participants in certain open world systems, right? And in that sense, instancing is a great tool that designers can sometimes use to curate a particular number of participants that you want. But the predominant amount of content within Ashes of Creation, over 80% of which is open world content. So instancing is very limited. But what we were talking about was how during like sieges or castle sieges or node sieges, you're going to have certain instance locations where it's only going to be a group that's designated to participate versus another group while the siege is happening. And I know in the past we talked about, well, how do you plan to incorporate these more objective-based waypoints as part of these larger events, and say that not only is it going to be a complement of numbers in the overall grand kind of battle perspective, but there's also going to be opportunities for smaller, more niche groups to participate in more focused objective capturing, right? And a part of that is going to be, small, very short, kind of 10-minute long instance battles where groups can go and participate against other groups that are defender versus attacker, and the outcome of which will influence certain aspects of the overall battle while that's still occurring in the background. Those types of interactions, I think, are going to be a lot of fun. That's a discussion that we had a little bit on the design side. Of course, that's going to get fleshed out a little bit more. Whether or not we see that in Alpha 2, I'm not sure if we will, but it is part of the design and how to incorporate those smaller group-based objectives as they work in concert with the overall larger battle.
So if that is the case, the idea that the numbers could be even at 250 versus 250 or 500 versus 500 might not hold true, even with sending players a long way from the siege when they die. So far that maybe they can't even get back in time before the fight ends. If you have 500 people parked outside and a constant wave of people coming in, that could severely offset the siege balance, and in that case, the side with vastly superior numbers is probably going to win in most cases. So that's why I am strongly on the side of them being instanced, because I think that gives opportunities for more fair fights, and it's not just about throwing numbers at the other side. But even if they do end up being instanced, if the limit is truly 250 versus 250 or 500 versus 500, there could certainly be sieges where one side does not fill all of its slots. So in that case, if one side has superior numbers and everything else is equal, the superior number side will win. But if the smaller side has superior tactics, I'm telling you, they can win. So for tactics, what do I mean? Well, tactics include things like group composition. Having a better group composition with specs that are more suited for large-scale PvP than the other side, even if the other side has superior numbers, can allow for you to win. Next, we have something simple, but something a lot of groups struggle with, and that is simply properly selecting and focusing down targets. A good group should have a great target caller, and in most cases, I don't think it should be the main raid leader, as the target caller needs to focus on that one role exclusively and be very good at it. Oftentimes, this is like a melee DPS that's in the front lines and calling targets. And in some MMOs, the rest of the group can use /assist macros to make sure they are selecting the same target much easier and more efficiently. If assist macros are not a thing, and it seems like maybe they will not be in Ashes, then players could set the main target color as their main focus and use the target of the focus frame, if one exists, to select the same target quickly. Sometimes there are actually enemy raid frames, and that makes it even easier to select targets for both the target color and the rest of the raid. We don't know if that will ever be a thing in Ashes, and my guess is it most likely won't, and there's no mention of it so far. Or maybe there will be a keybind to set your assist, which you do at the beginning of the raid, and another keybind to target the same target as your assist, which I've seen in a few MMOs. And then sometimes there's even, like in Guild Wars 2, where you have a call target button that literally puts a target icon above the enemy player, and then the rest of your raid has a keybind to take the target. The problem with that system is anybody can call the target, so Ashes would have to make some sort of way to have a selected group of people that are allowed to use that keybind to call targets to make this actually work. And while you have a target color, a backup target color for when the target color actually dies is a good idea as well. And then having the coordination to quickly switch to the new target color using whatever targeting method that you're using is something as well that you need to get good at. Now, who should the target color be focusing? Well, in general, as most people know, you want to kill the healers in PvP, but the problem is in a lot of MMOs and large-scale PvP, it's hard to kill the healers. But if you find a healer that's killable, that's squishy, and doesn't have a lot of defensives in his kit, then of course they are the priority. The problem is, like I said, a lot of times the healers are hard to kill, and other healers are going to focus healing on healers a lot more than they will on a DPS. So if that is the case, then your focus probably shifts to other squishy DPS classes. Ideally, a class that is a threat and is also killable is a good choice. What makes a class a threat in group PvP? Well, a lot of things could be the case, like the ability to do huge spike damage, or high overall DPS, or massive AoE CC potential. All of these things are huge threats. Over time, players are going to learn which classes are both threats and killable targets. What makes a target killable? Low health, armor, resistances, or lack of defensive cooldowns are all some good things that can make a good kill target. Now, you might not know all of these things. Intrepid has said in the past that you might not see the exact health percentages or numbers of enemy players. So if that ends up being the case during the actual launch of the game, then it'll be a matter of watching health bars as you're fighting the enemies to see which ones drop the fastest and selecting a kill target. Or it might be a matter of knowing which classes typically have low health and defenses, and knowing the class icons which are shown on the nameplate. Or later on in the game's life cycle, you might just know which players typically are easy kill targets. Once a kill target is selected, does the target caller just blindly have people focus that target forever if it is not going down? Or if the target has popped a large defensive cooldown that makes them immune to damage, or causes them to take drastically reduced damage? Of course not. Once a cooldown is used, that makes killing that target much harder, and you obviously in many cases want to switch targets unless you think you can burn through that cooldown fairly quickly. But the key is, if that target is a good kill target, you may want to switch back to it after the defensive effects wear off if you are struggling to kill your next target. A lot of times when two good groups are fighting each other, it's a battle of attrition to see which group can use their big raid defensive cooldowns first. So a healer that has a huge AoE heal on a long cooldown, or a bubble that makes a target immune to damage for 10 seconds. The first group that exhausts most of these type of cooldowns is one that is in trouble, especially if the other group has a decent amount of their big offensive cooldowns available. And cooldowns like pulls are going to be gigantic for getting targets isolated. Pulling a target and then hitting it with a CC by another player that hopefully is not on the same diminishing return is certainly a way to get targets down. However, the other team might have a way to pull their allies back. So again, it might be a situation where you're waiting on them to use those type of cooldowns, and hopefully your pull cooldowns and your CCs are up and you can again pull them back in and kill them. In general, the more knowledge of the game that the target caller has, the more they are able to be aware and mentally track cooldown usage, and the more efficient they will be. On the note of big cooldowns, should you just be using them on cooldown? In most cases, you should probably be saving them for when windows of opportunity arise, when your enemy team is vulnerable due to having wasted key defensive cooldowns, or if they're out of position, or if they're down some players. Then it's probably safe to start using a few cooldowns, although using cooldowns when you're ahead is not always the best play. Which brings us to positioning, which is another key tactic. In general, positioning is going to look something like this for most groups. Tanks and brawler melee types in the front line, range DPS behind them, and healers behind them. Now, healers in the back does set up the potential for stealth ambush attacks to take out key healers. So you may need to adjust this positioning depending on the enemy team comp that you are facing. One person getting caught out of position, if they are a key player, can turn the tide of an entire battle. So always be mindful of your positioning. Talking about tanks in PvP, Intrepid is committed to making tanks useful in PvP. There may be cases, depending on how tanks are implemented, where it might actually make sense to focus a tank and the target caller might actually call that out. But those cases in most MMOs are rare. I did an entire video on how to make tanks useful in PvP, and a lot of the best examples of tank gameplay in PvP came from Warhammer Online. Some skills, if the target caller is aware of them, boost allies' defensives as long as the buff is active, and you can quickly remove this buff by attacking the tank. Sometimes this buff can just be removed with a few hits, so it may not need the entire raid to focus the tank, just a few people. But this takes some extreme awareness and and game knowledge on the part of the target caller to see these windows. Other than that, tanks are often not the greatest targets, despite them potentially having abilities that boost the defensives of the entire raid, because they're usually just simply too hard to kill because of high health pools, armor, and resistances. But with projectile collision and player collision in Ashes, even without knowing the full tank kit, tanks can play a role for sure in PvP. Literally standing in front of your ranged DPS to absorb any projectiles fired at them is a big thing. It might be a tab target game, but with projectile collision, hitting your targets is not guaranteed as the projectiles can be intercepted. In addition, choke points can literally be blocked by tanks because of player collision. These two things are tactics that can and should be utilized by good groups in PvP. Another key tactic is to, whenever possible, try to outnumber fights. With the large number of players in the siege and the objectives all over the map, there are going to be places where you can imbalance an objective to take it as quickly as possible. Calling out numbers that are defending an objective, calling incomings to match or exceed the numbers that are incoming. These are all valuable things and one of the most important tactics to master. Another tactic is kind of an advanced one, but it's CC rotations to avoid diminishing returns. With this, you might have another target caller, but this target caller only calls CC targets. Or better yet, you might have another group in another chat channel that is focused on keeping key targets CC'd as long as possible. I will get into some logistics of Discord chat and multiple squad-based chat channels shortly. So the CC squad, in order to maximize diminishing returns, will want to focus on properly rotating their CCs through different CC schools, and oftentimes a good way to rotate CCs is to have multiple players CCing, because oftentimes one class will have quite a few of the same CC schools, and to get different schools you got to go to a different player. So this can be a little tough to master, but having a priority and really paying attention to the target frames to see what CCs are currently on the target, and knowing when your turn is up, and being able to eliminate people from the fight by properly rotating your CCs. This can be a highly effective thing, but it's a difficult thing to master. Now, you shouldn't just be CCing. You should still be trying to focus a kill target. Now, this could be the same kill target as the main raid, or it could be your own kill target that you have selected as your own group if you have a separate CC group. And again, you want to rotate through your CC schools, and oftentimes there's like 4 or 5 different schools of CC. And to get the maximum CC, the school that you're currently using can't have been used in a certain amount of time, and so that's how you rotate through them. In doing so, you're going to force defensive cooldowns, and this will eventually weaken that target and maybe make them even killable. A CC rotation might consist of a fear, then a sleep, then a polymorph, and typically these type of CCs are all in different CC schools in most MMOs. And again, this allows for the maximum CC duration on each before diminishing returns start to kick in. Once diminishing returns do kick in, I tend to believe that that's when you should rotate to a new CC target. Ideally, one that doesn't have any CC diminishing returns already, although that can be hard to decipher in the chaos of war. I touched on having the CC squad potentially in a separate voice channel. This is done to keep the chat clean for the main raid, as constant CC target spam could make comms overloaded. This is one of the biggest problems in large-scale voice chats, the lack of voice comms discipline. Important things like kill targets need to be heard by everyone, and it is also important for other things to be called out by anyone in the raid. Discouraging communication is certainly not good, but also the raid needs to avoid unnecessary communication as well. Examples of very important communication might be calling incoming at objectives on the map. Note the number of people incoming and be precise with your location and as few words as possible. One way to have a group in another Discord voice channel and still be able to communicate with them is to have 2 instances of Discord running on your computer. You can download Discord Canary, which is the beta version of Discord, to accomplish this. This is an advanced technique, but in doing so, you can have different squads in their own chat channels, with each squad leader also in the main raid to take commands from the raid leader and relay them to their squad as needed. You might have a CC squad, you might have squad squads that are dedicated to holding certain objectives on the map, and you might have a stealth squad which might be used to flank and outnumber fights all across the map. If they have their own chat channels, it allows them to communicate more freely with the squad leader, relaying things back to the raid leader. I touched on a stealth team, so now I want to expand upon that here. We do not yet know exactly how stealth works in Ashes. In the past, Intrepid has said that stealth will not render players completely invisible. They have said that there will be indicators that allow people to feel out where stealth individuals are. There will also be utility skills to allow players to reveal stealth, which is fairly standard. And they've talked about stealth augments from the road secondary archetype that incorporates stealth modifiers to the primary archetype skills. So in theory, a stealth team of more than rogues might be possible. It might be possible to have a full tank, healer, and rogue stealth team, especially if there are group stealth abilities that give AoE stealth to allies. This team could be a great way to shift a stalemated fight by ambushing the healers in the back of a formation, while the main group is distracted by the main force that is fighting them. But the efficacy of this will depend on how effective stealth actually is, and we don't know that yet. Similar to a stealth team, another tactic is portal bombing. So in some MMOs, there are mass teleport abilities that can portal an entire group. An example I've seen is the Mesmer portal from Guild Wars 2. This can certainly be a way to ambush or surprise a group. But in general, ambush techniques that maybe you've seen in regular real warfare type situations don't really apply in third-person MMOs with everyone having 360 vision. You will need either stealth or some sort of teleportation ability to successfully perform ambushes, pincer movements, or any other similar military tactic. Next, we need to talk about metas and how that affects tactics. In a lot of large-scale PvP situations, tightly packed groups running around in a ball ends up being optimal, and player builds that work with that playstyle, with person-based AoE damage and healing being the main kit for most players. Guild Wars 2, World vs. World, and ESO Cyrodiil are often dominated by these death ball AoE spamming groups. Arcade in some versions had the death ball meta as dominant. In Ashes, player collision does limit how tightly the ball can be packed, but it doesn't necessarily limit the death ball from being optimal either. I'm personally not a huge fan of the death ball, but either way, if it does happen, learning to counter it or doing the same thing but better than the other side will be needed. Another tactic that is a bit of an advanced one and takes discipline from raid members to execute is respawn timer staggering. So if you're wiping a group, sometimes it can be beneficial to keep a few of them alive and slowly kill them one by one and not at all at once in order to stagger the respawn timers. Knowing the mechanics of the respawn timer are helpful here. Some respawn timers I've seen are literally tied to the real world clock. So with set times such as 15, 30, 45, and 0 seconds of every minute as a possible example. In that case, you know when the respawn is going to happen. Wait for it, and then finish wiping the rest of the group. Thereby, roughly half is in one respawn, and the other half is in the other respawn. This keeps the group split up, and oftentimes this keeps players trickling back in to get slaughtered over and over again until they finally decide to regroup. This can give you enough of an advantage to take a few objectives before they end up regrouping. Now that we have covered the general tactics of Ashes sieges, I'd love to formulate some basic siege strategies for both node and castle sieges using these tactics and knowledge of what we know of the siege mechanics. But this video is already really long, so I'm going to end it here. Depending on how this video does, maybe I'll do a part 2 with full strategies outlined for both castle and node sieges. However, I'm probably going to wait until they give us updated information on the sieges and the actual mechanics, and maybe we actually see them in game. I certainly appreciate you guys watching to the end. I know this ended up being a very long video, but I had a lot to say, and most of it, as I said, comes from experience in past large-scale PvP situations. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video.